Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the GRN's webinar for this August. Today's webinar is focusing on approaches for open licensing early-grade reading materials and is brought to you by GRN in collaboration with the Global Book Alliance. The webinar has two main parts. The first part will introduce forthcoming guidance on open licensing developed by the Global Reading Network. And the second part will share experience from the USAID-funded programs that have executed open licensing of early-grade reading materials in different contexts of developing countries in collaboration with local ministries of education. Therefore, the webinar will provide information on copyright and open licensing to the diverse stakeholders involved in early-grade reading improvement initiatives, and we'll also share best practices for open licensing early-grade reading materials in projects implemented in collaboration with local ministries and publishers in developing countries, and share success stories, challenges, and lessons learned in open licensing early-grade reading materials for literacy programs implemented in developing countries. Our main presenters today are Sofia Cozzolino and Dr. Amber Gove. Sofia Cozzolino is a literacy children's book development expert with over 15 years of experience supporting early-grade reading across Africa. Under her technical leadership, the Rwandan local publishing industry has seen tremendous growth over the last 6 years, largely through innovative work of Save the Children's Rwanda Children's Book Initiative. Through this initiative, Sophia has contributed to the pioneering of a sustainable evidence-based model for supporting the development of a vibrant book chain through capacity building of book sector actors, as well as designing initiatives to strengthen the demand for local language reading materials. Sophia currently works as a consultant supporting the Global Reading Network to advance an ambitious agenda of promoting improved development, access, and use of books for children across the globe. She has also authored several popular children's books. Sophia will speak first to introduce forthcoming guidance on open licensing developed by the Global Reading Network. So welcome, Sophia. And our second presenter is Dr. Amber Gove of RTI International. As a director of research within RTI's International Education Division, Dr. Amber Gove works on learning from RTI's efforts to improve education outcomes for children around the world. Much of her work over the last decade has been on the development and deployment of the Early Grade Reading Assessment, EGRA, a system-level diagnostic for understanding students' foundation skills in reading. To date, EGRA has been used in more than 120 languages and 70 countries to inform policy and improve instruction. Amber's research and policy interests include improvement and measurement of students' learning, education finance, conditional cash transfer programs, and factors affecting achievement, enrollment, and attendance. As a Fulbright scholar in Brazil, she designed and conducted a study of more than 1,000 families to assess the impact of a conditional cash transfer program, Bolsa Escolar, on students' attendance and achievement. Her scholarly publications include a 2011 edited volume entitled The Early Grade Reading Assessment, Applications and Interventions to Improve Basic Literacy, and Early Grade Reading, Igniting Education for All. Dr. Gove received a PhD in International Comparative Education and a Master's in Economics from Stanford University. Dr. Amber will share RTI's experience of open licensing EGRA materials by taking examples from the USAID-funded programs which RTI has implemented in different countries. Amber, you're welcome. We also have Linda Herbert, who will provide opening and closing remarks for this webinar. Linda is a senior advisor of the Global Book Alliance. After each presentation, we will break for a few minutes to receive and respond to your questions you might have regarding this topic. So we'll have 2 breaks We'll break 5 minutes after Sophia's presentation, and we'll have another session for question and answers at the end of the presentation. My name is Aristarch Limo from Reading Within Reach, GRN. I'll be moderating this webinar. You are all welcome, and I hope you will enjoy the webinar. I now welcome Linda Herbert to provide opening remarks. Welcome, Linda.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Limo. And it is really a delight to be also supporting this webinar as the Global Book Alliance. As you may know, the Global Book Alliance is a collaborative effort by a number of organizations, both multilaterals, bilaterals, and two major NGOs, say the Children and World Vision, as well as IDEA, to tackle the book chain gaps and challenges that we find across the whole spectrum of trying to really fill the lack of books at the local level for children so that they can learn to read and read to learn. We are delighted to particularly talk about the open licensing today. We are very interested at the GBA, and I know a number of our partners who are on the GBA are interested to really look at how we can advance this idea of open licensing so that we can really provide a lot more materials and books to children across the entire globe. So we're delighted to have both Amber and Sophia provide us with this additional information, and we hope that through this process we can really advance this not only through USAID missions and programming, but across the multilaterals and the bilateral organizations that are part of the Global Book Alliance. So I'm going to turn it over to Sophia and welcome everyone.
Thank you, Linda. As Limo kindly introduced me, my name is Sophia Cozzolino, and I'm a consultant working with the Global Reading Network and also with Save the Children. So I'm going to apologize in advance. I have a bit of a cough, so I'll try to speak clearly, but I am a little under the weather. So today we're going to talk about approaches for open licensing of early grade reading materials. And I want to specifically introduce an information and guidance note that has been recently developed by the Global Reading Network that is forthcoming. It will shortly be shared with, I think, the whole community. But right now I want to talk through what kind of information is in it and how it might be useful to those people tuned in today. So if we can go to the first slide, Stephanie. I want to give a little bit of background for the guidance notes. It was prepared by Reading Within Reach, as Limo mentioned, which is a 5-year initiative funded by USAID and implemented by URC. And it draws heavily on several previously developed documents that were relevant and on topic. One of them is a fantastic resource developed by Neil Butcher, Elizabeth Levy, and Christy Van Gogh. It's called Open Licensing Made Plain, and it really tackles the concepts and the challenges and the opportunities that are present within this open licensing option, particularly for African publishers. So it's a bit of a unique resource in that it really speaks to African publishers about some misconceptions or some information gaps that they might have around openly licensed books and specifically. The second one it draws from is a resource developed by RTI, by Anna Robledo, who had hoped to join today, but unfortunately can't make it. And it speaks about open licensing for when we talk to ministries of education in low and middle income countries, kind of what are the key messages and what are the processes that are recommended. And it's developed based on RTI's experience with their early grade reading program in Nepal, which is one of the first initiatives to really embark upon this open licensing opportunity. And I think Amber's going to speak a bit about that in the second half of this webinar. And then the third resource that this document draws on are all the informational notes accessed on creativecommons.org. And I really encourage anyone listening today to follow up by looking at the Creative Commons website. If you haven't been there yet, there's a huge wealth of information, comprehensive resources for users and prospective sharers of content. So go to creativecommons.org, and I think you'll be amazed at how much content you can find there. If we go to the next slide. So the objectives of the guidance. So we're looking at how to provide information on open licensing to the different stakeholders involved in early grade reading improvement initiatives, particularly those supported by USAID. Not exclusively, but this was really looking at USAID as a key donor requiring implementing partners to openly license early grade reading materials. So how can those people involved in that process, those relevant parties, the host country governments, the USAID mission staff, the implementing partners, all of the NGO staff, publishers, everyone else involved, how can they understand the process of planning for and applying Creative Commons? And I really stress the planning aspect because I think that this is one of the recurrent issues that is talked about throughout the guidance note, is how we can properly plan for openly licensed materials throughout the life of the project. So the second part of the guidance note looks at what some of those associated strategies are for successful implementation of openly licensed materials. And it's looking at from procurement phase to inception, throughout the life of the project closeout. What are those critical considerations that projects need to, and USAID and publishers, everyone needs to think through, you know, that appropriate time. And I think it's a comprehensive process that a lot of projects have been learning as they go. But this guidance note tries to tease out what some of that learning is in order for future projects to be able to make more strategic decisions. And then the next slide, what's contained in this open licensed early grade reading material resource. So it first looks at some of the key terminology related to open licensing and copyright. And I think this is where we, right from the get-go, we tend to sometimes lose some people in terms of understanding this process because it can start to sound very legal and very technical. So really breaking down just what the basics are in terms of licensing and copyright for you to understand it without getting your organization's lawyer involved. And then it looks at the explanation of the benefits of openly licensed reading materials. Why are we, I mean, this is so much more complicated. Why are we trying a new model? You know, why don't we just stick with what we have always done? So look at what some of the benefits of openly licensed materials are and the rationale for openly licensed early grade reading materials. It explains a bit USAID's policy on open licensing as a requirement for implementing partners. And then it breaks down Creative Commons licensing options, which I'm going to talk about today, what those options are in order to choose and apply the most appropriate Creative Commons license. It then has, I think what's a bit unique about this guidance note is it looks at what are some of the tips or advice for working with host country governments to openly license early grade reading project materials. I think many projects have had challenges trying to get the buy-in from local governments to understand why they might want to use different licensing terms for curriculum materials, particularly those that they feel are, belong to the government and there wouldn't be any advantage for them to openly license them. So what some of the rationale and the talking points and the tips for working with host country governments are to really understand and buy into that process. Similarly, some tips for working with the creators of content, the publishers and the authors specifically, because we're talking about books often. So how do we collaborate with publishers and authors to find openly licensed terms that they are also comfortable with? So what some strategies are for talking to and establishing those relationships. And then the last part of the guidance is specific for USAID and implementing partners. There are two different sections on what the process of using Creative Commons licenses is and those critical considerations throughout the life of the project that I mentioned. So here it really breaks it down specifically in each phase of the project, what what we should be thinking about in order to make sure this is done, this process is done correctly. So we can go to the next slide. I'm now going to jump into the basics of copyright and licensing. And I know that this webinar is building off of a series of open licensing webinars. And I think Cable Green has talked about really eloquently a lot of these copyright and licensing issues. But just so we're all on the same page, in really simple terms, I'll talk through what kind of these key terminologies are. So in the context of early grade reading programs, we're usually talking about books, so I'll stay limited to that, or some kind of written work. So in simple terms, copyright safeguards the ownership of intellectual property. If an author holds copyright to an intellectual property, there are several rights that are automatically correspond to that property per the terms of the copyright. So I think what's key to understand here is that copyright is automatic. As soon as a piece of work is created, the creator, the author, automatically owns copyright to this work once it is in a fixed tangible medium of expression. Once it is there, the copyright is automatic to the author or the creator. The author can then assign by selling or giving some of those rights to others, including a publisher. And it can be debated in a court of law, the legalities or the technicalities of that copyright, but copyright is something that is automatic once work is created. The license is a document that allows someone to use the author's work based on those rights assigned. Go to the next slide. So now all rights reserved versus openly licensed materials. So historically, most educational resources have been under these all rights reserved copyright terms, which dictated how the works were adapted and distributed. So publishers or individuals or organizations would use all rights reserved copyright terms in order to retain the exclusive right to sell or otherwise protect the work. So under these all rights reserved, it's kind of the most restrictive way to retain your copyright terms. It requires any third party, anybody who's interested in using those materials or copying them or distributing them, they must have explicit written authorization from the creator of that content. So that process of seeking the explicit written authorization, it can be easily denied, or it can necessitate a fee, which is often the case. You need to pay if you want to access or use my information. So it can then be restrictive. So all rights reserved is the most restrictive copyright terms, but historically it has been the most common copyright terms for most written works. So openly licensed materials, in contrast, allow the copyright to remain with the creator, the owner, the author of the content. So I think that's really key to understand. Copyright is not being relinquished. So under openly licensed materials, what the creator is saying is, I still own rights to this content, but I am allowing reuse, adaptation, or distribution of the content without first requesting permission from me. We're going to look at what some of those different licenses are that can facilitate different uses, adaptation, distribution, and you can see what the different options are, but the key principle to understand is with openly licensed materials, allow people to access or use the materials without first requesting and receiving permission from the copyright holder. So I hope that's clear. And I think if everyone has understood what the difference is between the all rights reserved copyright terms and the open licenses, if we can just go to the next slide, and I hope that some participants can suggest what some potential benefits are of openly licensed early grade reading materials. If we're kind of shifting the model of really restrictive all rights reserved copyright terms for content, why? What are some of these potential benefits? So if you guys can type in some ideas about potential benefits, if you really think through issues of accessibility or quality, sustainability, I'd love to hear from you guys what you think some of the potential benefits are of openly licensed early grade reading materials, and we can hear from you guys. Limo, I'm not sure I'm able to see the comment section. Are you able to share what some of the suggestions are that are coming in from participants?
Let me see what is coming in here.
Here, I can help. This is Stephanie. So we have from Anjum, access to quality reading material to organizations and individuals. Taxpayers benefit by only paying for materials once. Lower administrative burden for use of materials. Consistency and cost efficiency in replicating successful programs and no need to reinvent the wheel. And then a major benefit, if the license allows adaptation, is the ability to translate the materials, allowing more language communities to take advantage of the content. Then adaptation of material to local contexts, and other projects can benefit for validated materials.
Good list.
Yeah, some great ideas there. I think you guys brought up some of the really key principles of cost effectiveness, particularly around reinventing the wheel. There are great materials, but very few materials are adapted from scratch. So if we're able to really access what has been done previously, then yeah, I think that we're able to save a huge amount of time and resources in terms of drawing from existing resources. Also the point around translation. This is a huge benefit of openly licensed materials. Something has been done in a larger language community, how that can then extend to more underserved language communities who don't have such a comprehensive resource of early grade reading materials available to them. So I think that there's a huge range of reasons why we would want to, as educators, invest in openly licensed early grade reading materials.
Sophia, I just wanted to point out this last one because I think it's important as well, that someone included that not all countries have signed on to the Marrakesh Treaty, enabling adaptation for accessibility. So Creative Commons allows one to do this without getting authorization. And even when the Marrakesh Treaty is in place, the process for adaptation and distribution often isn't clear.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I think we can see it as kind of a great equalizer in a lot of ways in terms of the disparities between different countries, contexts, as well as different individuals from socioeconomic statuses. It's really an equalizer in terms of allowing broader access to materials, high quality materials that have been developed. So if we continue now, I think we've talked about some of what these amazing benefits are. It's easy to understand why the US government strongly supports an open licensing policy that requires education resources, or that encourages education resources to be seen as a means for significant, sustainable, socially responsible contribution to the quality of learning and teaching children across the globe. So I think USAID would like to see its investment in early grade reading carry the greatest weight. They want to see it reach the most children for the longest period of time. So when they fund materials to be developed with all rights reserved copyrights, there's a greater risk that these materials will not be freely or widely accessible, either in the years following the project's implementation or in other, globally, how it might be more limited in terms of who might be able to access and benefit from those materials. So in line with this US government's vision, USAID endorses a policy that requires publicly funded resources to be freely available and openly licensed. So since 2015, all educational resources developed through USAID funded early grade reading programs are required to be licensed through the Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 International License, known as CC BY 4.0. And any grantees wishing to deviate from this requirement have to receive an explicit waiver issued by USAID. So it's been I mean, it's been a process for USAID and for implementing partners to understand this requirement in order to implement it successfully. But we're hoping that this webinar and this resources is all going to help streamline this process. So now as we started talking about Creative Commons, we can jump right into the next slide that specifically talks about, we talked about the idea of open licensing, but now what is Creative Commons and what are Creative Commons licenses? So Creative Commons is actually a nonprofit organization that provides this well-known suite of open licenses that have really become the global standard in terms of legal tools that are accessible for people to access and apply open licenses. They're growing rapidly. There's millions of Creative Commons licenses that are now already applied, and they make it really easy for anyone to use and reuse content. So Creative Commons are the recommended license by USAID for a few reasons. The biggest one being that it's the most frequently used open license for any kind of open educational resource, which makes it easier for users to learn about their rights. It's becoming very commonplace. So there's a huge wealth of information about Creative Commons licenses and how you can use, revise, remix different openly licensed materials in lots of interesting ways. So again, I want to stress that Creative Commons licenses are not an alternative to copyright. So they are something that respect copyright, and they sit on top of copyright. So creators can modify their copyright terms to best suit their needs. This is really the key idea here, is that Creative Commons do not replace copyright, but they allow creators to specify what terms of copyright they want to use. So Creative Commons lasts for the same length of time as applicable for their copyright terms, and they permit certain reuses, enabling the creator to specify the conditions of reuse, while also ensuring that their work is credited. And I think that's really key, is that creators of content, when they use Creative Commons licenses, they can then ensure that they are getting the credit, the acknowledgement for the work that they have done. That's one of the key benefits. So the next slide, we're going to look at what the different types of Creative Commons licenses are. There are 6 different kinds, and I think when choosing a Creative Commons license, the copyright holder needs to weigh the importance of retaining control of future adaptions of the work, or future commercial use of the work, how the work is shared, as others adapt it. So they need to weigh the importance of these different aspects in order to choose the correct Creative Commons license that allows or disallows varying levels of restriction. So there are 6 options for Creative Commons licenses right now, at least. The first one, CC BY, it's attribution. So this license allows others to distribute, remix, tweak, build upon their work, even to commercially benefit. So even to sell work for financial profit. They can essentially access this work and do whatever they like in terms of changing, adapting, selling it, as long as they credit the original creation. So as you can see, this is the most accommodating of licenses offered. It's recommended for maximum dissemination and use of licensed materials. Again, this is the preferred licensing option by USAID, as it does really allow for the materials to be used and optimally in the most possible ways. The next option is attribution share alike, or CC BY SA. So this license allows others to remix, to tweak, to build upon the work, still again, even for commercial purposes, to financially benefit from it, as long as now we have 2 requirements. They must credit the original creator, the author of the work, and they must license their new creations under the identical terms. So in any CC BY SA content, the new works based on the original work will carry the same CC BY SA license. So any derivatives will also allow commercial use. So this one's similar, it's kind of putting this extra requirement that anyone who accesses and uses your materials must also then kind of pay it forward in terms of allowing their work to also be accessed under the identical terms. The third option, attribution non-commercial. So CC BY NC. This license lets others remix, tweak, and build upon the work non-commercially. So some content creators are not comfortable with others accessing and making a financial profit selling the work. So it allows others to be able to adapt the work, build upon it, but they must acknowledge the original creator and also not use it for any commercial purposes. It doesn't require any derivative works to be licensed under the same terms, just the kind of acknowledgement and the requirement that the materials cannot be used commercially. So these are the first three options that Creative Commons licenses allow. If you look at the fourth one, around attribution, non-commercial share alike. So now we're starting to add different variables. We have CC BY NC SA. So this license allows others to remix, tweak, build upon the work non-commercially, as long as they credit the original creator and license their creations under the identical terms. So it's a combination of the first three licenses that we saw. And then the fifth one, attribution, no derivatives, CC BY ND. So this license allows for redistribution, commercial and non-commercial, as long as the work is passed along unchanged and in whole with credit to the original creator. So the key point here is that there should not be any derivatives of the work. The work must remain intact as was originally created. You cannot make any adjustments to it. It cannot be translations. You can't change anything to it. It must stay originally intact with credit to the original creator. And then the last license is the most restrictive of the CC licenses: attribution, non-commercial, no derivatives, CC BY and CND. So it only allows others to download the work and share them with others and credit the original creator. So you can't change it, you can't use it commercially, you can really just access it. That's all. So what is common across those 6 licenses we can see is that you must always credit the original creator, and then the different terms of how the content can be used after that, they all vary within those 6 different options. If we go to the next slide, you can see a flowchart that says which Creative Commons license is right for me. So implementers of reading programs, as they work with government counterparts or publishers, you should really collaborate to agree on the appropriate license for the specific program-related materials that are being developed. So what option makes the most sense for this program, for these materials? What option is everyone comfortable with within these 6 choices? So what you see here is flowchart. It's can be found on Creative Commons website, and it helps creators select the most appropriate CC license based on their preferences. You can say, you start here, am I okay with other people copying and distributing my content without asking my permission? And you kind of go through these different options to land on which license might be most suitable for you. It's a great resource to help people understand how easy this process is. It's available, I think, in 40+ languages, so you can check, and you might be surprised how many different languages this has been translated to. So it's also another resource that is available for you. So,
Sophia, yeah. I just wanted to interrupt real quick because I think this we had a question before we get too far away from it. So we have a question that says, you noted that USG grantees wishing to deviate from USAID's requirements on open licensing must get a waiver. Does this actually apply to contract holders as well? I have also heard from some people that holders of cooperative agreements are not beholden to the requirements. Can you provide any clarification on this issue?
Yeah, I'm going to provide an unofficial clarification, and then Linda might jump in with something more official. Yeah, I've also noticed that this hasn't been applied to cooperative agreements that I have been a part of, and it has been more explicitly applied to contracts. So it seems to be the trend. I'm not sure if Linda wants to add anything else, if this is kind of the official policy, or if the idea is thinking about also applying this to cooperative agreements.
Right. Thanks, Sophia. We will have to check on that because I don't know if it's a requirement under the cooperative agreement. That's a really good question. And so it would have to actually, we'd have to look at the requirements there. But we can get back to you on that.
Okay, thanks, Linda. So before I wrap up, just the last slide has a bit more information. You can contact me for anything I talked about today. And then a few plugs for more excellent resources beyond the 3 that were cited at the beginning of the presentation. If you look at Creative Commons, they're frequently asked questions. It really helps clear up, I think, a lot of these basic ideas for people struggling to understand open licensing and Creative Commons. There's even a video there too for people who it's easier for them to watch rather than read. And then I really like this resource made around information on business models that use Creative Commons licenses. You know, what is an open business model? How do you generate revenue? This is such a new area. This resource was developed in 2016 and it's really groundbreaking because I think everyone's still trying to figure out how do we use open business models to generate revenue. And then another excellent one by Neil Butcher and his team, Good Stories Don't Grow on Trees. It really helps you understand how, if you're going to use some of these open licensing principles, how do you effectively cost the storybooks to make sure that this process is done really strategically. So I encourage you to also look at those. And I think that we're going to pause here for questions, and then Amber is going to talk more about specifically some of the strategies for working with governments and publishers based on their experiences with RTI using this open license requirement. But I will pause here and take some questions if participants have them.
Thank you, Sophia, for a wonderful presentation. And as Sophia mentioned, we are now inviting you to send your questions related to what Sophia has presented. We have 5 minutes for that.
And Sophia, can you see the chat messages now? It's a button on the bottom of the Zoom screen. If you hit the chat button, it'll appear.
Still not seeing it.
Put your mouse all the way down in the black part of the window.
Mm-hmm.
You see a bunch of buttons.
I'm not very
Sophia, it might be on the top for you since you're currently sharing a screen, but I will share the first question with you that says, can you please discuss what you see as advantages of open licensing for copyright holders?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we touched a bit on this, but it would depend on who that copyright holder is. I think for a lot of up and coming or aspiring, lesser known authors, there's huge advantages. I know there have been some authors who have really made their name and gotten some acclaim by openly licensing their materials. It increases your visibility, right? If you need to pay for a book, you're less likely to make that investment. But if it's free and you can just click on it and download it, you're more likely to, take that risk and read the material. So it really helps you kind of develop a brand with very little risk to your potential audience. So I think for up and coming or aspiring names, it's a huge advantage. But that same idea of increasing your reach can be extended to publishers also. I think publishers tend to think that they have a lot to lose by allowing more open licensing terms. But in reality, I think that's not the trend that we're seeing. I know I spoke to one publisher who had recently released some of her content kind of as a promotional sale on Amazon. And there would be, 2 days where you could freely access her materials. Even if it wasn't openly licensed, it's kind of the same principle. You could freely access her materials, these storybooks, for example. After those 2 days of them being freely accessed, she then would see sales go up. So I think that it really allows people to just kind of take the plunge and access your materials and then see if they want to afterwards financially invest in them. Whereas if you are kind of a smaller publisher and you don't have such a huge reach, this can add a huge advantage, I think.
Okay, so then we have another question. Are you familiar with cases where the host government wants to have sole ownership of the material produced? I think sometimes there's a misunderstanding of ownership on the host government's part.
Yeah, this is really a central question. I think this is probably the most common issue that IPs have encountered. And Amber is going to get into this a bit, but I can weigh in and then she can add to it. I think most governments are reluctant to, as the questioner asked, they feel as if they are relinquishing some control over their national curricular materials. They don't see the advantage of that. And I think what's key is really helping them clear up that idea that they are still the copyright holders and help them to understand what some of those advantages are. For example, if the materials can be accessed easily and adapted, how teachers might even use that to create resources that are multi-level, that can be used more broadly in and out of their classrooms, how parents could also draw on those materials, how this is really an advantage for the children, the parents, for everyone that is supposed to be benefiting from these materials, the teachers, rather than really keeping these restrictive all rights reserved to publishers or to the government. So I think clearing up what some of those misconceptions are and then highlighting what some of those benefits are as well. And as I said, in the resource that will be shared, we have some of those key talking points for the government that can help them understand what those differences and benefits are.
Great. And then we have another question. Do you need to have ISBN for the materials the project develops before providing material through CCL?
Through Creative Commons?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, these are two completely different processes. As I said, copyright is something that happens automatically. It is you automatically own copyright to your material developed. So Creative Commons is a way for you to have a legal tool that officially recognizes you as the owner of this copyright. And then specify how you want people to be able to use that or disallow how you want people to benefit from it. Whereas ISBN is a completely different process that looks at commercial aspects, and they are not linked in this case, and I wouldn't encourage USAID or implementing partners to try to navigate that ISBN process if they're not into commercial publishing.
Okay. And then finally, we have more of a comment that's addressing the earlier question about cooperative agreements. Mm-hmm. So Mark says, it's my understanding that the USG can't make it a requirement under cooperative agreements as the rights in developed materials is defined by 2 CFR 200 and rests with the recipient, who therefore has control of the IP from the start, whereas with contract rights and data clause restricts the contractor from taking rights without CO approval. So in essence, no, the US government can't impose CC licensing on recipients.
That sounds like it makes a lot of sense to me, but I think I will work on trying to get a clear confirmation from USAID. As I said, I have not seen on cooperative agreements this requirement being applied, so it makes sense if it is around the ability or the intellectual property rights.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then real quick, one final question. I'm not sure if it will yield a different answer, but Nugroho from Indonesia wants to know what are the benefits of using an open license for an illustrator?
Yeah, I think that when developing this guidance note, we had a separate section for illustrators, but we found that a lot of the benefits are quite similar to authors. Again, it's about developing a brand, getting people to see your work, to know your work, how that's going to generate future business for you. and how you can develop kind of a business model around that. So I'm not sure that there's specific benefits unique to illustrators. And oftentimes as you talk to stakeholders, I know we have addressed illustrators and authors together to talk to them about, you know, how they can mitigate risks and both yield those benefits of open licenses.
Thank you, Sophia, for responding to the questions and for participants for sending questions. I now welcome Amber Gove, Dr. Amber Gove, to share RTI's experience on open licensing L-grade materials. She has some examples from different countries that RTI has been implementing L-grade reading programs. Dr. Amber, you are welcome, please.
Thank you so much. And thanks to Sophia for a great foundational presentation. She really explained a lot of the legal background in a really plain way, which I think was really helpful. So that'll really help set up this presentation. So again, thanks for having me here. I am presenting this on behalf also of Ana Robledo, who's in Manila right now. It's past her bedtime there, so we thought we'd let her get some sleep. And I've collaborated with her over the years, and all of our project team members, some of whom may be on this call and may be adding a little bit more information from their direct experience in country and working on a lot of these issues. So next slide, please. So just going over the basic outline of the presentation, what we'll be talking about today is really a bit more of the, if I can phrase it as maybe political economy of working with governments and publishers to get their support when possible for open licensing. We will talk about what we have experienced in terms of how the government and publishers tend to prefer which type of license and how to negotiate that. We've got a couple success stories on this, and so actually be talking today. We've worked with, from our tally, about 7 different countries on trying to get these materials licensed. That means we have 7 entirely different approaches to how this has been done and what's been accomplished, if not more than that, because sometimes it may start one way and then move in another direction and then go back to the first way. So there have been a lot of bumps in those roads, but we've certainly learned a lot. So we'll talk about the challenges and some of our reflections and lessons learned. So at the very least, you can hopefully repeat our successes and not replicate our mistakes. And then lastly, provide a little bit of overview to all of you on what we would recommend going forward. Just to quickly summarize the countries, we have Nepal was the earliest, as Sophia mentioned previously. Just a quick summary on that. A big lesson there, and one that I'll probably hit on a couple times, is that this was put into the this was one of the earliest ones that USAID had done. It was put into the contract. And unfortunately hadn't really been discussed with the government prior to it appearing in the final agreement. And so along the way, repeated negotiations trying to get there, the government never agreed to it, and it wasn't actually able to come to fruition. Malawi merit was another one, and that wound up requiring an amendment. Open licensing was not actually supported by the national laws. So one of those lessons I'll certainly be passing on today is get a legal team involved early on how to negotiate these terms. The next one just to share again, this list of 7, Nigeria RARA was a research pilot. So we were able to include that. The ministry wasn't as involved, and so those materials were able to be CC licensed. There was approval there, and there may be others on this call too who can add direct stories for that at the end of this. And then we have the Uganda experience, which is actually a cooperative agreement. All of these other ones so far that I've talked about have been contracts, and so we voluntarily, that example I'll share a little bit more detail on, we voluntarily were able to add that to the materials and work with the government to get that placed there. Kenya Chisome is another one, and that one's another really interesting process that we can go more in detail. And then we had Cambodia and then also Liberia. So those 7 countries, we've had some process, and again, as I said, really 7 or more different outcomes on that. But please, if you have a particular country that you're interested in, let me know in the chat, or we can ask as a group at the end. Okay, next slide, please. So as Sophia alluded to, education departments and ministries are frequently concerned that open licensing may have negative effects. So they're worried about low quality adaptations of their resources and that those materials could eventually reach their schools. It could be the case that some of those materials that were not developed by the government but were approved by the ministry could be adapted under a different, under a CC license in a way that doesn't align with their curricular standards and could affect learning outcomes. So you can imagine if you had the most open license like a CC BY, and then there were whole sections that were added to what was the official textbook approach, and new pieces were put in there that the ministry didn't necessarily agree with, that they would be upset by that. The Creative Commons, though, has developed language to address this, and the different types of licensing that Sophia went through, particularly the no derivatives one, would really help to assuage some of those fears. At local levels, there's movement towards a policy that does embrace open licensing, but it may require a bit more strengthening of local legal structures and controls to protect governments and other copyright holders. So I think that no derivatives version is probably the one that we found, at least when we're able to get to a licensing approach, that that may be one that the governments are most happy with. Okay. The second piece, just on the engaging with governments, is that this explicit permission issue, many of the governments we found want someone to come to them. And so even when you point out, look, for Chichewa, for Malawi, wouldn't it be great if they could use it next door? In Zambia, which also has a large Chichewa population, and they may eventually agree to that, but they want to know about it and they still want the permission. So Sophia highlighted this. Eliminating the permission piece makes it much easier for others to adapt and use the content, but ministries still felt nervous about this and want to know how their materials are being used. Okay, next slide, please. So this slide goes through some of the key benefits of the Creative Commons licensing for materials and some of the messages and talking points that you can use with national governments. Sophia touched on these again, but I want to reinforce them. And also I included in the comment section too, in the chat, the Open Licensing Made Plain document, I think, does a really good job of walking through some of these arguments for different audiences. So you should definitely use that. So the first benefit that I think will be most important to relay to ministries, which should be at the core and center of their entire mission, would be that when students have free access to these textbooks and readers, particularly on any other devices, you could imagine a situation where the paper version of the book that a ministry is producing could also be made freely available in smaller chunks and messaging to parents on their own devices to read aloud to their children and to allow that reinforcement. If the materials were open license, it would be so much easier for a web developer, an app developer, so that they can adapt the content and use that and spread that out. And one example that I know is certainly used in US schools, for example, is Newsela, which takes content, both regular copyright held content with permission, but then also open license content, and develops different digital leveling approaches from news stories, so that a teacher in her classroom, let's say with different, if she had 8 different reading levels of children, she could assign the appropriate leveled content to children, so the vocabulary gets automatically digitally altered and can be used at all those different levels. So that's just one example of particularly the, hey ministry, you've got this great print content, let's think about getting it out freely and easily on a digital platform to complement your print content and reinforce those learning opportunities. The next argument I would make would be that when teachers can have regular access to the textbook and materials, digitally again, they may be able to do this even when the hard copies are not available. So if you have budgetary constraints on distributing the physical textbooks every year, but you've made it available for teachers to print themselves or to get them online and access them and be able to reproduce them on their own, that is a way to help improve classroom instruction and get more materials out there and available for others. The third case to be made certainly is about efficiency and productivity of public spending. So open licensing can facilitate more productive use of public funds so that you can actually expand the availability of the content in local languages. You may not be able to, as a ministry, adapt your content or support the funding of your content and the adaptation of your content into another 8 languages, but perhaps there's a group in the country that wants to take that on, and if they can take the original content and do that translation and adaptation, that could really help to expand the availability of the materials, particularly in local languages. There's a lot of cost savings when edits to existing books need to be made due to errors or curriculum revisions. So titles in the global marketplace can also be easily adapted or used locally. And then again, that adaptation and translation process, you don't need to recommission the book every time or start from scratch. There's one issue in this, just to make sure that we're reflecting on and considering, is that this may alter the original development or purpose and the meaning, message, or essence of the language used in the original material. That's why I'm stressing a bit the adaptation rather than direct translation, which is just something that we certainly always need to consider when we're developing material in any language. The other argument to make would be that Creative Commons licenses are really good at clarifying for future users the proper legal use of the content. So there is a lot of illegal use of content, and what this does is it allows more legal use and is very specific about how follow-on users should use it. The last bit is promoting literacy at all ages. So access to reading materials won't be limited just to those enrolled in formal education. Out-of-school youth and adults can also benefit from open access to the materials. So again, that may be by spreading it through different format and media, either through digital or being able to reprint, for example, sections of books and materials that were developed and reprinted into newspapers, which is something that I know has happened quite a bit in South Africa, for example. Okay, next slide. So the detailed case study I'm going to provide a bit of history on would be Uganda, and then Malawi and Nepal are the 3 examples I'm really digging into a bit today. So this explains, this slide really explains a bit of the background on the School Health and Reading Program, or SHARP, materials that were developed. One correction there, it was a cooperative agreement, so it was not required in the agreement. We worked with the National Curriculum and Development Center to hand over the materials. One of those terms of negotiation on the materials development was that so we, as Sophia indicated, it held copyright because we had developed the materials. We then handed over that copyright in an official legal document, but as part of that document, the National Curriculum Development Center agreed that that the content would have a CC BY license on those materials. And some of the reasons why that worked really well in that case is that both USAID and RTI agreed up front to this transfer of copyright, and the Curriculum Center, in fact, many of our ministries, Malawi and Nepal being 2 other examples, there's definitely a national pride aspect component to it. I believe one of our ministries at one point said there's no way we would ever have a textbook where we didn't hold copyright. We would never, and that's quite common, of course, in the US or in other countries. Our national government, our school district and state governments here in the US don't regularly hold copyright of the books that they purchase and put into schools. It's the publisher that will hold the copyright. But for many national governments, having copyright and ownership of the content is really important to them. So having that copyright transferred was key to that success. It really helped facilitate follow-on work. So World Bank and Global Partnership for Education funded efforts that have since gone and expanded and reprinted these books and spread them throughout the country where USAID had not yet been able to reach. The last bit was through this long-running conversation, explaining the benefits and talking through with them, not coming in just straight up for, this is what's in the contract, so we absolutely have to do this, but actually talking, or the agreement, talking them through it and talking through the various options. They were able to really appreciate those benefits. And I see I have a couple questions in the chat, one of which is really long, so thank you, Mark. I will follow up on that and I'll pause in just a minute. So that was kind of a quick summary of the Uganda program. The next slide, please. Okay. So I think this may answer one of the Malawi questions in the chat. And after discussions with the legal team, both here in the US and then those in Malawi, we learned along the way that the Creative Commons open licensing requirement was in direct conflict with national laws around copyright and licensing for educational materials in particular. So I can follow up on that particular question. Oh, hi, Odala, and get back to you on the specific law that the group there indicated that there was this conflict between their laws and what was in our contract and what we had been required to do. So as maybe another lesson learned in that regard, a lot of this, by the time it's put into your contract or agreement, or encouraged in your agreement and explicitly put in your contract, it would really be helpful to all of the implementing partners if this had been previously discussed, negotiated, and agreed upon between any funding organization and the direct government partners. So I can't stress that enough. The last example real quick was Nepal. As I mentioned previously, this is another one of those where it had been, I think, put in the standard terms of the contract and there hadn't been a lot of discussion yet with the government. You'll see some of the reasons here. The government themselves was apprehensive about losing any control, even when we talked about the most restrictive, no derivative, share alike, non-commercial type of license. They were still not interested. This had a negative impact long-term on the production and delayed some of our material production. So being able to get this sorted out up front in the project design phase would be something, certainly if there are any USAID officers or other donors on this call, I would, whenever possible, not leave this to be done after projects are signed. It would be great if this were negotiated and agreed up front. Okay. Just to tell you, on the case of both Malawi and Nepal, eventually we needed to have the contracts amended and waivers included in the contracts. And then maybe, Odala, just to answer your question in a little bit more detail, I have some additional notes. The Malawi Institute for Education allowed reproduction by other parties, but only for educational purposes and without prioritization of the MIE. So that was part of it, but the laws for copyright for education materials specifically had to be developed by or through the MIE and therefore had to belong to MIE. That's what I have. I can follow up with you, and Anna and I can follow up with you if you have more specific details that you want to know from this. Okay, next slide. So we also need to remember that copyright laws, not every country is yet following the kind of global standards for copyright law. And so each of these national laws do supersede our USAID contract requirements. So those all need to be researched in advance. We tend in our Q&A for solicitations to ask if this has been negotiated or agreed upon in advance, so that we can have a better understanding of what we need to do at the start of a project. The next point, just to, as I think I've highlighted a couple times, copyright really matters to ministries of education and national staff, and we need to be cognizant of that and aware of that. And so being very clear and explaining the difference between copyright and licensing, and stressing, as Sophia said, stressing that they still will retain copyright. It just this will make their life easier, and that people don't have to come back and ask permission, and then make everyone else's lives easier in being able to share and reproduce and pass on that content in a much easier way. I think pointing to examples where this has really worked and it's helped to expand rapidly the availability of content to other users in the country. The Uganda example of World Bank GPE being able to quickly reprint without any debate or argument the materials that have been validated and trialed and approved and licensed by the ministry is a really good one. So if we can continue to build examples like that, the Nigeria example also, where we had developed the initial content and then the follow-on implementer was able to quickly print those again and get them out without having any disagreements or challenges in getting that out again, is another really great case to make. Because I think what ministries and all of us as implementing partners and taxpayers ourselves want to happen is as many books as possible in the hands of as many children as possible, as quickly as possible. And then having some flexibility. So USA just went for the easiest level with that CC BY requirement, but having some flexibility and recognizing ministry's concerns, particularly use of the no derivative license and no commercial. Those would be the ones that I would think that we have in our own experience found that ministries were definitely a bit more open to. So use that and use it well, because it can really help overcome some of those concerns about copyright and access to materials. All right, next slide. All right, this is just a last quick summary of some of our recommendations and at which stage we would love to have a bit more effort and understanding. And just to state quickly that this is really complicated stuff. Very few people understand even the difference between licensing and copyright, and being able to separate those two is really key as just a first step. So that you shouldn't feel bad if you don't get this and you need help on it. The materials and content that are available on the Global Reading Network website and are have been shared today, and this great new guidance coming out, please do explore that deeply and understand it, and then make sure that you are consulting with copyright and intellectual property legal help as well. But at the proposal stage, we would strongly encourage certainly any donors or funders to make sure that this is part of what's negotiated in the agreements with governments even prior to issuing proposals. That open licensing needs to be really, if you're not able to get to that point and it's embedded in the contract, then allowing plenty of time so that this doesn't delay the distribution of content or the finalization and agreement for that content would be really important. At project startup, it's going to take a lot to educate the staff to understand all of those 6 different licenses and what are in there. This shouldn't be something you save to the end of the project and then slap it on in the front matter. The content creators, any of your illustrators and authors need to, in their contracts that if they are paid contracts to contribute and develop that material, they need to be aware of what will happen to this material going forward, and that needs to be clearly communicated. So that's in that throughout the life of the project section. The content creators are really completing the authorization forms, agreeing to all of the terms. Everyone's got plans for what will happen to the online and offline versions of those open resources, and then disseminating that information about where they can be accessed. And then at closeout, all of the finalized, editable, licensed digital materials need to be put on all the proper platforms. For USAID, as you know, that's typically the Development Experience Clearinghouse. And I think we all have a responsibility to be submitting also to the Global Book Alliance and making sure that we're communicating the availability of materials. So in that regard, I will also point you to, in addition to what's on the Development Experience Clearinghouse as required by any of our agreements, the RTI does have its own knowledge platform website called shared.rti.org, which I'll put in the chat. And you can see some sample materials. We're continuing to put those final license materials up on a regular basis, so please come back and check that. But you can find many of our materials there. And the last slide just has our contact information. You should feel free, if you want to go to the next slide, feel free to reach out to me or to Anna on any of this, and happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Amber, for your very informative and useful presentation. We now break again for question and answers, and we have 10 minutes for this. So I encourage everyone to send questions to panelists, including the first presentation, so that we can address any challenge or any question that is being asked by different people. I can see some here coming.
Yeah, and I can read them all too. So while I'm waiting for a couple more, hopefully, I just want to quickly summarize, since I learned both about Cambodia and Kenya in a little bit more detail in the last couple of days. So the Kenya is an interesting one. And what was finally negotiated is that the ministry actually, we transferred copyright to the ministry for use in Kenya, but RTI retained copyright, and we plan to open license all of the Kenya materials for use globally. So that was an interesting mix of negotiations, that Kenya Ministry of Education has the rights in Kenya and they, as far as I know right now, do not plan to make that open in Kenya, but globally the content will be open under our copyright. So that's an interesting hybrid model. And then the other example, just quickly on Cambodia, all of the supplementary materials and readers that have been developed will be open licensed, and we hold copyright. We may be transferring that copyright to the ministry by the end of the program. But any of the textbook pieces, the ministry has not been interested in open licensing, and they plan to continue to hold copyright. So that's also a mixture. You may have where some of your content may be, and it may be easier to do that with leveled readers or smaller reading books, but the textbook really is, I would say, more of a sacred issue that a lot of ministries aren't that interested in open licensing, at least so far in our experience. Okay, so I see a question from Juliet on training materials. I will add that in Liberia, our training materials have also all been open licensed. So it really all depends on what's in your contract with USAID, and then what you get asked to do. So if it's limited just to the supplementary, so textbooks and reading materials for children, then that may be what you do, but that you shouldn't feel constrained. It certainly makes it easier for everyone, and I think we all as taxpayers would benefit from not recreating the wheel every time, particularly on training content along with the children's materials. Okay, Mark, I'm going back to your longer question about Morocco, Mozambique, and Afghanistan while I read it. Yeah, so that approach I think is working. So you say an proposed approach is allow the contractor to copyright Creative Commons license and then transfer sign the copyright to ministry as part of the property disposition at closeout. I think that that's where this has worked really well for us. That was essentially how it was set up. That it was already that they knew that what we were handing over that they would have their name on it for copyright holder, but it had already been agreed that a condition of that copyright handover would be that it would be open licensed. Of course, if you don't include any of this in the front matter of the material, it's really hard for people to know that you've open licensed it, which is why I'm including all of that. And I will, I had real quick just to show you what this looks like. Here's the link. Here's a link to the Nigeria housing materials on the shared .rti.org site, and you can see we include the deck link there, and once you open that, you can see the front cover PDF and the CC BY license that's included there. So Mark, your question on the Kenya example, that the global license would supersede the Kenya restrictions. So I talked to our legal team yesterday about this, and so we're still drafting as far as I know, and I haven't seen the final version of what the front matter will look like. But as I understand it, it would say something like, in Kenya, so this is globally, this is copyright held by RTI, Creative Commons under these conditions. In Kenya, however, Ministry of Education holds all rights to distribution, etc. And it's the same way you might see, the example they used was sometimes for a sweepstakes or a you have different requirements even in the US about you can't participate in the lottery, I don't even know, in Wisconsin. So that we have, you can have territorial restrictions on the licensing approach. So it's still in the works, and once the Kenya materials get posted to ShareEd, I will know exactly how we're managing that language, but that it's going to be some combination of this RTI global. If you want to use it in Kenya, you have to contact the ministry.
Thank you, Amber. I don't see any more questions coming.
I don't either yet. So there may also be others on the call from RTI who have, so I'm not sure if you are able to allow them to speak. But if Wendy or Claire or others are on the call to jump in, maybe they could indicate in the chat because they may have additional stories to provide.
Okay. So are they online now?
I'm not sure, they're not popping in the chat, but oh, there's Wendy.
We've got it, yeah. Go ahead.
Okay. Is Wendy, are you able to allow Wendy Relangita to speak?
Yeah, just give me 1 second.
Okay, thank you. And then I see Maria Jose Castillo from Juarez added a question, and I love it. Who wants to do a panel on lessons learned in these experiences? By the way, my other hat that I wear is as CIS treasurer, so the conference deadline for all of your abstracts is September 15th. It's early this year. But it sounds like we could have just either a kvetching lessons learned conversation on this process, for sure.
Hi, this is Wendy. They allowed me to speak.
There's Wendy.
Hi. So I just wanted to thank you very much, Amber, for your lessons learned. I probably don't have as much to add as I might have, because you covered it very well, I think. But I just want to, I'm still working on the Nepal early grade reading program as the senior reading advisor. And so I did want to reemphasize that we've been trying for 4 years to get the government to buy into the CC BY. And we did reach an agreement with the donor towards in the last year to use the more restricted license, and we're hoping that that will help us move forward. But it's been a struggle as the government staff changes. We have to start over again, trying to help people understand what this is. As you mentioned, a lot of people don't understand the difference between copyright and licensing. Their main concerns were the control over when people made changes, knowing who's using it and how. And it's just been a struggle, particularly because there's been a lot of transfer in the government to really help them understand. And again, like you said, having had at least starting the conversations during the design phase before the proposal, before it was hard boiled into the contract and everything, I think would have been really helpful. So I appreciated all those lessons learned that you mentioned and sort of want to reemphasize.
Thanks, Wendy. Do you think, I was kind of hypothesizing that it might be a little bit easier with supplementary readers or smaller books than the kind of heavy, weighty, important textbooks. Would you agree that that was the case for Nepal as well, that you might make more traction with the readers versus the textbooks?
Yes, definitely. There seems to be more investment in them. The sort of control that they want over their textbooks in terms of adaptations and sharing and that sort of thing, that it does seem to be easier with supplementary readers than with the textbooks themselves.
Okay. And then I know you're making me remember this too. It's also super important to distinguish what we've mostly been talking about today is what goes on newly developed materials that are funded by the government. And we need to think completely differently about existing content that may or may not have an indication inside as to, in other words, we've been asked in some cases, oh, this NGO developed this thing, can you go tell them to give it to us for free and slap a Creative Commons license on the inside of it? We said, well, we can have that conversation, but they clearly invested a lot in this and maybe they didn't agree to that already. So just making sure as we talk to all of our partners that this is not something too that as implementing partners we can just go out there and tell another implementing partner that the content that they had already developed with their own resources separately should be made open licensed. So I think you face that in Nepal as well, right, Wendy?
Yes, that we did. And there's also complications with, in our case, USAID was giving some funds directly to the governments as well as funds to us for technical assistance. So that also complicated matters because who exactly developed the materials was not even a simple question to answer.
I see Allison's added a pitch for open licensing of teacher training materials. So Linda, that may be something to talk to USAID about in terms of what they're asking for, if it really is limited to the readers or in textbooks, or if it should be certainly part of some of the other content that's developed. And I will just point out the case of Liberia, for sure, we have been asked to extend the CC license to all of our coaching instruments and teacher training content. So that is happening at least in one project.
Great. Amber, we'll definitely keep that in mind. I know that has been discussed, as Allison mentioned, between the reading team here at USAID and the GRN staff. So that's great. Yeah, we'll bring it up.
Okay, thank you. Now we are running short of time, and once again, thank you, Amber, for the presentation. I now welcome Linda to provide closing remarks.
Thanks, Limo, and thank you so much, Sophia and Amber. This was really a great overview of the information on Creative Commons, as well as what we mean by copyright. So the clarity around that is really very welcome, and I think it's really important for all of us, both as donors as well as implementers, to keep in mind some of those lessons learned that Amber particularly talked about, having a real clear understanding of what we mean by Creative Commons, the different levels of it, and then having those conversations early on with the ministry so that we can move this forward. Because the ultimate goal in all of this is, as both Sophia and Amber said, is to be able to have much greater access to the materials for children across the globe. So it's very welcome. I would also say that the plug for the GDL, thank you, Sophia, for that. I think that's really important. The GDL does hold open licensing on all of its materials, and we are constantly looking for other materials that we can upload into the GDL to make all those materials accessible to ministries, to teachers, to implementers, to missions, and others. And keeping in mind that our goals here are very much in line with having quality materials that are accessible, as well as lowering the cost and making this much more cost efficient for governments, so that they can, in the end, provide a lot more material with the budgets they do have. So I wanted to thank everyone, and I would strongly encourage you to look again at the PowerPoints. I think there was a lot of great material there, as well as the recommendations. And I would encourage us to continue to have this dialogue and push this forward, particularly with, of course, USAID, as they look to provide a lot more material in the future. I love the fact that Amber raised this issue about former material that hasn't got a license, and then future material. So we want to ensure that future material is available. So thank you so much, everyone, and back to you, Limo.
Thank you, Linda, for closing remarks. And Jennifer is reminding here that we anticipate having the open licensing public for the GRN within the next 2 weeks, and we'll make sure that this webinar participants receive it specifically. Thank you, Jennifer, for that information. And once again, I thank everyone for participating in this webinar. We are now marking the end of this webinar, and thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Also, Jennifer is referring to the open licensing paper, which Sophia has authored.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.